Hi, everyone, again. Thanks to those new people joining the call. I'm Josephine. I am the brand manager of the Glenlivet. A couple of housekeeping rules as we have a couple of people rolling in. If you could please mute yourself while you're coming in, as well as turn your camera off. That really allows us to help us streamline the experience. We do have quite a number of people joining, so also help the connection as well. And we're just waiting on a few more people and we'll get started.
My default was to mirror epic greeting, but I realized I didn't know talking man.
All right, everyone, time to get started. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Josephine Chu. I am the brand manager of the Glenlivet at Pernod Ricard USA, and of course, a proud member and co-lead of Pernod North America's Asian Pacific Islander Employer Resource Group called Mosaic. Wanted to thank everyone for joining us today during API Heritage Month. This is actually the first of a series of events we'll be kicking off during the month of May, and appreciate everyone making the time to attend. I'd like to start out with some brief thank yous to those who made this incredible event possible. Firstly, Southern Glacier's Tracy Kamek and Erica Shea, Pernod Ricard's Lainey Montoya, Jonathan Saw, and Aisha Omaya, our partner Sierra Lee, and our panelists, and of course, you guys. This event wouldn't be possible at all with the assistance of all of these amazing people. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. Number one, please mute yourself upon entry. We definitely encourage you to ask questions or make comments. There's also a way on Teams to be able to engage and give reactions with the chat function. We love to make this as much of an interactive experience as possible. Our volunteers and IT team will be monitoring as we go and can assist throughout the conversations. Given the amount of participants on the call, we are reaching now triple digits. We ask that all non-panelists, if you could please turn off your video. While we love seeing everyone's faces, this will help us streamline the panel and mitigate any choppy services. If at any time you experience difficulties hearing, please try to redial into the conference line or ping in the chat and someone will come to assist you. Now, some of you may be wondering, what the heck is API Heritage Month? Well, in 1992, the U.S. Congress officially designated May as Asian Pacific Islander, or API, Heritage Month in order to reflect two important milestones in Asian American history. The first one is the immigration of the first Japanese to the United States on May 7, 1843, and the second, and on May 10, 1869, was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was largely built by Chinese immigrants. While those are only two of the many accomplishments this community has made to the society, this month celebrates the history and contributions of all Asian Americans with roots and ties to two distinct geographies: Asia, which comprises of the Far East, Southeast Asia, and Indian subcontinent, and the Pacific Islands, which includes Micronesia, Polynesia, Guam, and Fiji. So to kick off the month, today we'll be highlighting the unique experiences the API community faces within their career growth trajectory and the cultural nuances that contribute to that experience. More importantly, we'll be providing insights on how members of the API community can advance in their careers and what others outside the community can do to support their career growth. I am your moderator today, and I'd love to introduce our panelists. We have Cindy Chen, Vice President, Associate General Counsel at Pernod Ricard USA, Emily Yue, Chief of People and Strategy at David Yurman, Lisa Reed, Senior Director and Head of Brand Marketing at Ignite, and Heidi Klein, Vice President of On-Premise Sales at Southern Glazer Wine and Spirits of Colorado. Cindy, Emily, Lisa, Heidi, welcome. Would you mind giving a quick intro of yourself and share your career journey that got you to where you are today?
Sure. I mean, I can kick it off. I am an attorney, of course, by trade. I started out I actually post-college, actually started out in banking, but law was always sort of where my passion laid. And so I worked for a law firm for a number of years doing mergers and acquisitions. Then I went to Johnson & Johnson and worked there for a couple of years before then decided to come even further in-house. And now I do not just M&A, but sort of a wide array of things. I like to call myself, my team is sort of like the garbage can of the legal department because we handle everything else that is not marketing or HR related.
And Emily, would you like to introduce yourself if you're on?
Hi, everyone. Great to meet you all. My name is Emily Yua, and it's been funny. I think the short version is I've always been really incentivized to think about how people create change. And after graduating college, where I studied political science, I felt like the closest thing was entering marketing and new product development. So I served a bunch of different companies in terms of thinking about what incentivizes customers to buy. And I think that's something probably many of you can relate to. And I remember right before, I was like 24 years old working for a startup, which was then called ComScore. I was employee number 12. And I think many of you probably, this is way when I'm dating myself. And I just remember sitting next to the founder and saying, I love doing this stuff. And you keep saying, like you have great ideas, but no one's listening to me. And I'm 24 and I feel like I could do a bunch of different things. And he said, and you're using all these business words completely wrong. Why don't you go and get educated on business? And so I went to business school thinking that I would go back into the tech startup world. And I got recruited by McKinsey and Company, where I thought I'd stay for 2 years and ended up staying for 15. And when I left, I was the I was the head of strategy and organizations for McKinsey. And I call myself the unexpected Yurmanite, because had you told me, way back at McKinsey that I'd be working at Yurman, I would have probably been quite surprised. But I think the key here is about, this is a company that has seen insane growth. It's really insane growth. I'm not a luxury girl, but it's all about creating change and how do we take it to the next level and how do we create something that's even more than the sum of its parts. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for sharing your background, Emily. Very excited to dig into a couple of those experiences later on. Lisa, Heidi, would you like to give some intros as well?
Sure, I can jump. Yeah. Do you want to go first? No worries.
Oh, go ahead.
So, hey, I'm Lisa Reed, and I guess when we talk about career trajectory, I'm here because I didn't do what my Filipino immigrant parents wanted me to do, because in my family, there were 4 career paths. There was farmer, there was teacher, there was nurse, and there was doctor, and special dispensation would be granted if I were to become a lawyer. So, that would have been okay. So, when I started my career like 25 years ago, I started in the advertising agency world at Young and Rubicam. And so, my parents had absolutely no idea what I did for a living. And so, I started from the ground up. I came in as an admin working in new business. So from 9 to 5, I was doing things like expenses. I was booking meeting rooms. I was, trying to find people and pull them into said, meeting rooms. But then after 5 o'clock, from 5 until like 8:59 a.m. the next morning, it was like go time, working on the new business team, learning how to pitch, learning how to prospect, learning how to make decks. Honestly, one of the best formative experiences in my entire, career. And so, it was funny, right? Because eventually you stop being the admin and they're like, hey, we're going to promote you to account coordinator. So when I told my parents this, they're like, honey, is that a good idea? Because like in accounting, you're supposed to be good at math and you're not very good at math. And so they had no idea what I did. So I think, but I pushed on. For the first half of my career, I worked on big, blue chip global clients, learning how to create campaigns that build global brands like Colgate-Palmolive. The second half was a bit of a pivot. I learned how to build agencies. And then I took on a role leading digital transformation to help both my clients and my agency colleagues learn how to kind of support new capabilities, build teams to do things like e-commerce and content at scale. in my last kind of advertising agency role, I was at VML Y&R, and during the 3 years that I was there, I got to do two really, really cool things. Sorry, if I told you where I was, I figured it's slightly appropriate that I'm at the Chief Clubhouse right now, which turns into a bar in about half an hour, but people have started early, so you might hear a shaker in the background. So in my last role in the agency world, I was doing two things. The first thing that I did was I was leading the Pfizer business, where we won the COVID vaccine. So that was like pretty awesome. And I was also working with my teams to kind of help them evolve, right? Because Pfizer had this ambition to be the most patient-centric, company in the world. So I was really proud of the work that we did in that space. The other thing that I really got to do, and that shaped kind of the way I think about my career, was I got to be one of their first co-chairs for Be East, which is the Asian ERG. So that was a formative experience for me, and it's informing a lot of what I do in my new role over at Ignite, where I'm head of brand. And so, if you're familiar with technology companies, they're really good at focusing on the features and all the cool stuff that they do. And sometimes that focus is at expense of brand. So that's where I come in. But I think true to form at Ignite, I'm really lucky. I get the opportunity to help build my second ERG, which is Agents at Ignite. So thank you so much for having me here. This is going to be awesome.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you so much for sharing that background. You certainly have a colorful one for sure. And Heidi, you're no stranger to a lot of us. Would you like to do an intro?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Hello, my name is Heidi Klein. I have a slightly non-traditional background. I was born in Korea, South Korea, outside of Seoul, and adopted at the age of 12 months. Flew on a big airplane to LAX with a bunch of other little Korean babies that were getting adopted out of LA. And I grew up in a very traditional white German American family, hence the name Heidi Klein. Moved to Colorado at the age of 13 to a very middle-class suburban community called Highlands Ranch. My brother and I were the only two Asians all through high school up until I believe our senior year, and then there was a few more that moved into the community. So with that said, very traditional family. My father went to UCLA, my mother went to Cal State. They did expect me to do something great and grand, and I decided I wanted to be a teacher. So I went to college to teach, and then that quickly was changed into marketing, and then changed into communications, and then business management. But I've always been a people person. I love to travel. I love getting to know others. I love to be able to enjoy experience and hospitality and really be able to lead and to mentor and to coach. So with that said, I got into hospitality. So I fell in love with eating and drinking and traveling. And I was working at the JW Marriott in hotel sales. And then I moved into Southern Glazer's Wine and Spirits. So I've been with Southern for 14 years. I've done pretty much every job within the on-premise sector in this industry. I have worked very closely with amazing people at Pernod Ricard, like Yoko Toyota and Kevin Fitzgerald and Mackenzie Potter. And there's so many other people to name, but I'm just very happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you all the panelists for joining today. As you may have heard that, as an Asian community, we're actually quite diverse. And for some people on the call, the word Asian might cue a particular meaning or a particular demographic background. But I think what you've seen is that the Asian community is quite diverse, and it's actually one of the most diverse communities out there. So Heidi, I have a question for you actually, as it pertains to maybe your career in hospitality or going into Southern Glazer's Wine and Spirits, which is, do you think that your API culture or heritage has had an impact on your career trajectory? And if so, how? And panelists, feel free to jump in as well.
It's an interesting question, and I think it is definitely something that can bring awareness to discuss this topic. I think personally, because I was raised in a non-traditional environment and because I was raised with a lot of white American people, I definitely had to make sure that I set myself apart from others to be taken seriously, but also to be considered someone that had additional assets and features available that were maybe like not necessarily something that they would consider. So, for example, when you work in hospitality, there's a lot of different prejudgments and pre generalizations about an Asian woman in hospitality. And for me, as I continue to grow and advance in my career, it'd be often that, I would walk into a room with, a peer that was a man, or, somebody of other cultures. And immediately they would just assume that I wasn't the manager that was going to be leading the meeting, or that I wasn't the one that was helping coach and or mentor that person that was sitting next to me. So at a very young age, what I realized was I needed to advocate for myself. I needed to almost be outspoken to make sure that I was being heard and that I wasn't overlooked to the woman sitting next to me that was potentially a blonde white woman, or the man sitting next to me that may or may not have been of color. So that was something that I was very aware of at a very early age. And it almost incentivized me and encouraged me to be an advocate for women of color, to be able to be leaders and to be able to lead by example.
That's so interesting, Heidi, because you touched on a very important topic, which is called code switching. And for some of you who might not know what code switching does, it actually involves adjusting one's style of being, speech, appearance, behavior, expressions in a way that optimizes the comfort of others in exchange for things like fair treatment or quality service, or even in this case, Heidi, potentially like being recognized as a manager or other like employment related opportunities. Now, we all tend to do this on occasions, like we maybe want to be a little bit of a different self when we're meeting our bosses or something else. But actually studies show that minority groups often rely on it more so because they're focusing on their well-being, economic advancement, and even physical survival. So Lisa, Cindy, Emily, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this too, and if your API culture and heritage has had an impact on your progression in your career, if you did face code switching, and if so, how?
I mean, I think I have had similar experiences to Heidi as well, particularly when I was an attorney at a big law firm working in mergers and acquisitions, which is traditionally very male dominated. And anytime I walked into a room, the expectation was that I would not actually have a seat at the table. I would sit on the chairs, like outlining the outside of the room with the table. And I'm like, but I'm the one that's actually going to be making the changes to the documents, negotiating the, agreements. And so I think, similarly to Heidi, I also learned how to be much more outspoken and sort of more proactive, I guess, about making my presence felt, which is very difficult to do because I'm 5'2". It's not easy. And, just sort of taking up space or oxygen in the room to kind of say, hey, I'm here. And also what I have to say is valuable. I, early in my law career, I worked with an associate. I was a junior and worked with an associate who had actually 3 female Asian associates work for him consecutively, all who were very different personalities, much more quiet spoken. And he was, a bully, really, pretty misogynistic. And I remember going into my partner's office and I was like, after 2 or 3 months of working with him, I just said, all right, well, I'm never working on another deal with him. And they were like shocked. They were like, what are you talking about? And I was, they were like, all these other associates worked with him before. I've never heard this complaint about him before. And it was clear that they had not spoken up, but they all left the company. And I was like, I don't know what you think that is if it's not indicative of their time with him. And I was like, and I'm happy to leave as well. Like, I don't really, having worked in banking before, I was used to getting yelled at, but I was like, yell at me when I've done something wrong, please. But, anything else outside of that is not really justified. So certainly have experienced that, sort of put it, not necessarily a damper on my career, but it's certainly been an extra, I think, invisible burden, if you will, because I think people don't like to think, oh, maybe she had to work harder or better to get to that same place. They don't like to think that there's like an unequal level playing field, and a lack of recognition, I guess, for the fact that you do have to carry that invisible burden because it's just what you're born with. I'm Taiwanese and by culture, and obviously I can't change my physical features, nor would I want to, right? So I think in that respect, certainly it shaped and formed a lot of my personality as a result of that, just, having to sort of stand up for myself in certain situations like that.
Thank you for sharing, Steve. Oh, sorry, Emily. I think I heard you go off mute.
Oh yeah, I did. I was just sorry, what a rookie mistake. How long have we been doing virtual? I was just gonna say, this is a really interesting conversation that we're having, because I think I was born on a labor camp in Southeast China because both of my parents had been sent for re-education. And I was born in the first year of the one-child policy, and I'm obviously born a girl. And so I think there's a really interesting context in all of that, because I think for anybody who, and by the way, my parents were so elated that I was a girl. And so it's a whole, nuance of growing up in a context where the narrative for me was, you're a girl and you're going to do just as well, if not better, than all the boys in this context, and we're going to kick their butts. And so I think that framing of me coming to America was so fascinating, because when I arrived, I didn't speak any English. And I think, as many of us do, the name of the game is assimilation. Mm-hmm. And how do I speak English without an accent? How do I show up and, have all the inside jokes? And at some point, recognizing that I grew up in Minneapolis, which I totally resonate with all of the sort of very Scandinavian. I thought I was probably Swedish until I went to college, and it's a joke, but not really, because I think there is a sadness of not really recognizing that you are different. And I think it wasn't until unfortunately, I was probably slow on the uptick, but I didn't realize that I was, like Cindy, you were saying, sitting in the back of the conference room. And I didn't realize that, I wasn't being recognized for the work, because in my mind, I thought if I was just heads down, I would get recognized. And I think my journey there was an inflection point in that journey, because the first person who saw me, the first manager or the sponsor or mentor who saw me as something greater than I could be and helped me see it, was such a huge unlock. And so I think I share that because I actually think there are many of you who are on this call who are going to be scions and scionettes of industry, and who will be an unlock for others, and who perhaps, if you look up, will see those who could be unlocks for you. And I think that is such a profound thing to recognize. And I think that was for me. I'll share the second anecdote, which is, I think a real challenge that I recently had in the last 10 years of my career was when I moved to Switzerland. I'm married to a, blonde hair, blue-eyed, boy, and we have two, mixed children. And we moved to Switzerland, which I think is a beautiful country. But it was the first time that somebody said to me, "What languages do you speak?" When I listed the languages that I spoke, said, "Well, we don't do that here." And it was such a moment. This is like 2013. You would think it was like Mad Men season 1. Like, not only was the expectation that now that I had children, I would stop working, there was also this notion of, you just don't belong here. What are you doing here? And the reason I share this is because the name of the game for me had been assimilation. So what do I do as a good immigrant? I hunker down, I learn the language. I wasn't great at it, but I could speak it way better than my blonde hair, blue eyed husband. And yet society chose to recognize him every single time over me. And so I share this because I think there was another unlock, which was I went to one of my mentors and I said, Mary, I'm working so hard. I'm speaking German. I'm doing everything I possibly can. And she said to me, she said, what do you think people hear every time you get on a conference call? And I was like, American? And then she said, what do you think people see when they see you from down the hallway? Asian? And so she said, why are you trying to be something that you're not? And I know it sounds so hokey and, whatever, but there's something really powerful about authenticity and really living in that authenticity. And for me, that authenticity is Asian American. And so I'm not perfectly Asian and I'm not perfectly American, but you know what? That secret sauce of being assertive but respectful is great. The secret sauce of being mindful of others, but self-conscientious. And I think we have such a superpower that we actually have to recognize that there is excellence in that secret sauce. Anyhow, I don't know if that resonates with folks.
No, I mean, if I could just build on what you're saying, because what's fascinating about, I think, the three stories that we've heard, from Heidi, from, Cindy, and from Emily, there's an irony there, because on the one hand, right, there is this mental toughness and fortitude that is kind of ingrained in us from day one. If I think about, like, it's funny. I mean, I always knew that we were different. Like, I grew up in a predominantly white community in the middle of West Virginia, right? And that's another story for another day. But it was wonderful, like, I had a great childhood. But like, my parents always impressed upon me, like, you know what, nobody's going to give you anything. You're going to have to work for it. But at the same regard, you're going to have to keep moving forward, so keep your head down. So, that balance of, knowing who you are, knowing what you want, and just keep plugging away. Because at the end of the day, if you protest, is that going to stop your progression forward? So, like, don't say anything, because at the end of the day, you're stronger than the insult. Keep rolling, keep rolling, keep rolling. And like, that's kind of what I did for many, many years. Like, one of the things that I wanted to share, like, okay, not quite Mad Men season 1, more like Mad Men season, like, let me do the math, it was like 60s, maybe like Mad Men season 30 something, because this would have been like 1999. This is my second year of work, and my first kind of account coordinatorship, rotation was up. I was working on an account, and it was my time to go get transferred. Just so happened that the woman coming to replace me also happened to be Filipino. And I was like, oh, that's kind of funny, because like, I hadn't met another Filipino in the industry yet. So it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. Yeah, it was cool until they started referring to her as the next Lisa. And so it didn't matter how well she did in school, because I'm sorry, but that, she had the grades, she had the resume, she worked her butt off, she got the same role that, maybe another cohort of 20 other kids that year, got. Like, she was reduced down to being, the second version of me, because she was coming in to like replace me. And like, it's common, we do that, but like, it's just like, it's demeaning on so many levels, especially at the beginning of your career. And like, I don't have many regrets. Like, if I have one regret, when it comes to like working career choices, I was 23, and maybe age is an excuse, maybe it's not, but I didn't say anything. And I didn't say anything. I knew in my heart that something was wrong, but I didn't have the words to express that emotion. Like, I didn't know why it was. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't say anything, because like, what do you call out? Because at the end of the day, is it offensive? It is offensive. Are they going to get why it's offensive? I think we have more perspective now, and we can put into words why it's so offensive. So, that like that sucked. That really, really sucked.
It's an interesting thing that you bring up, Lisa, because I think we do it quite all the time. People are kind of cycling through jobs in this new day and age, and we say the next so and so. But I think what we may not recognize is that maybe particularly with certain community types, that you'd actually probably call that a microaggression. And so for people who might not know what a microaggression is, they're kind of defined as like the everyday, subtle, really not intentional at all interactions or behaviors that like communicate some sort of bias almost. And you may think, oh, the next Lisa is pretty, nonchalant, doesn't feel like, you're trying to say anything about anyone, but actually it could cue a certain way for that particular person, especially if they happen to be of similar backgrounds. And so I wanted to touch on a handful of different topics that all the panelists kind of touched on, which was the notion of some prejudgments that people may have about the API community. And we kind of listed them here. So like us, kind of fill in the blank, as an API person, you're expected to do blank. And so I'd love for the panelists to kind of articulate some of that and then also highlight how maybe the stereotype does work or does not work and how we can break them.
I mean, I would say that it's ironic. I think that part of my personality was, in terms of being forthright and upfront, is for sure modeled after my mom, who also was very much that way. And yet, ironically, and it happens now, even whenever I exhibit those characteristics, whether I'm telling a joke or that maybe a little, off color or is sarcastic, and she's just like, why do you need to be so unladylike and so, like un-Taiwanese? Like, why do you have to be so un-Asian in that respect, right? And, I'm like, I don't really think that those are like cultural things. They're just personality types, but ironic in the sense that somehow by being outspoken or being authentic to yourself and your own personality type, if it's not just this quiet, meek, put your head down, don't say anything, don't rock the boat, that it's somehow seen as anti-cultural, when really we know all different personality types make up a culture and a population. But I think that inevitably stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason, right? There is a seed of truth to that, certainly embedded in culture. But I think, it's the thing that happens and that we carry inevitably, that I do wonder sometimes, like when I walk into a room, I sometimes think to myself, do I need to do something to counteract that prejudgment right up front from the get-go? So does my handshake become more firm? Do I speak louder? Do I take my place at the table? Well, I always take my place at the table, and all of you should take your place at the table regardless. But it is, I think at this stage of my career, now there's an inflection point where now that we're experienced and established, it becomes your calling card, if you will. It's become more of an advantage in terms of standing in your authenticity. But I do think that, certainly helped my career, sort of being unwilling to cave to what other people's misconceptions were. If anything, it was probably even better in some instances, feeling like people underestimated me. I walk in, I'm an Asian American woman. They don't think that I'm going to be the one negotiating a multi-billion-dollar transaction. And yet here I am, and well prepared, right, to kind of, take them down that line. So certainly the challenging of the expectation is great in terms of being able to upend that, but also kind of bittersweet in that there is anything to upend in the first place.
It's funny, like, it's interesting. Like, the other thing that's kind of fascinating is sometimes, the impression, like, there are a lot of Asian women that sometimes look younger than they are. And so the perception of, inexperience when you walk into the room, like they don't understand, to your point, like you're the one who is doing the deal, you did the documents, everything forwards, backwards, sideways, right? And could we mix it if, you were asked to do it? It's like, it's funny, like the challenge of proving experience, because they don't see the experience, they just see what they see, like, that's something that, I mean, yes, it's a good thing. I don't mind like looking younger, but like it is a challenge professionally, or at least it was. Not so much now. It was earlier on in my career.
Well, we'll beat
I
them in the
think
long
for
term.
me, there
Lisa.
was a,
Sorry, go ahead,
I
Heidi.
think for me, there was a misperception because I was raised by a white family living in the suburbs of not to knowing what to expect. You know, is she going to behave like an American? Is she going to behave as we would expect her to as an Asian American woman? And what has she been taught about her culture growing up? And, you know, not really understanding nor expecting anything. And like I said earlier, for me, I was at a very young age where I was always very outgoing. I was very grounded. I was pretty outspoken. And my parents were like, wow, like, whoa. And, you know, so as I got older, it was just interesting as I started to meet other Asian women. And I was like, wow, I'm like, this is very interesting to be surrounded by Asian women that I had never been around growing up in the suburbs. So it was really eye opening for me to see some of them that were, you know, they did fit that expectation, and they were quiet and they were passive, and they, you know, were very head down, going to do everything my parents tell me to do. And then some of the other women on the other side that were just wild and did not care, and they were rebelling against their, as we call it, their tiger moms, and, you know, telling their moms, I'm not going to be you, I'm not going to listen to what you're going to tell me. And it was just an interesting evolvement and progression for me, because now, you know, in my 40s, I am so blessed to have a handful of best friends, sisters that happen to be Asian, which is so interesting because I grew up my whole entire life with no Asian friends. It's just me and my brother. And it's amazing because I look around at these other women that I am so close to that are Asian, and they are just like me. They are so strong-minded, and they are outspoken, and they advocate for themselves. And it's just amazing to see, no matter how you grow up or what ethnicity you are within the Asian culture, that it's not just about that expectation and that stereotype that you're going to be quiet, you're going to take care of your husband, you're going to clean, cook, rub his feet, do the laundry, you know, and really that's the expectation. I mean, I've had many inappropriate comments to me as I've grown up throughout my whole entire life from men that are absolutely absurd, of just that expectation that was years ago of what Asian women are perceived as. And being in the hospitality industry, and, you know, being in restaurants and bars and working with chefs and working with restaurateurs, I mean, it was a very male driven industry, for a very, very long time. It's exciting to see the amount of women that have continued to grow and advocate to become leaders in this industry. And what that means for us is we have a voice. We have now a platform where we can raise awareness, we can teach the women and the men surrounding us that are either older than us or younger than us that this is not acceptable, this is not the stereotype, and we can change that narrative. And we have the power to be able to say, let's do better, let's be better, and this is how we're going to do it. It's funny because, you know, some of these examples is, you know, Yoko Toyota and I have worked together for over 10 years, and it's very common where people will call me Yoko, and people will be like, oh, is that Heidi? We look nothing alike at all. I love her dearly, but it's like, I wouldn't just say that to the guys that I work with. Oh, that must be Tom, even though it's like, no, that's Kevin. You know, so it's just these interesting stereotypes of women, and that all Asian women look alike, that you're supposed to behave in a certain manner. And I know that it's people like us that can continue to drive that narrative to change that perspective, because I think a lot of it, what it comes down to, is just education. People just don't know. You know, I've been called an Eskimo before, which is a very funny story that I'll save for later. And, you know, I've also been called Hispanic. So, you know, it's just the awareness of how do you handle those situations? How do you educate people? How can you talk through that? And how can you stand up for yourself and say, no, I'm actually not Yoko Toyota. That's hilarious, but we look nothing alike. I love her dearly. But no, she's Japanese. I'm Korean.
And I think that's the opportunity for us today, is because we've been known as the model minority. And for those people who don't know what the model minority myth is, It's a stereotype that as Asian Americans, we're polite, law-abiding, heads down. We don't really, raise our voice, etc. And we achieve a higher level of success, maybe more so than the general population, through some combination of whatever innate talent, because we're amazing at playing violin, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps, immigrants striving to make it in the United States, etc. And so that myth has continued to kind of perpetuate and perpetuate and perpetuate, to the point where probably the API community continues to perpetuate that myth. And also maybe the opportunity for us now is to kind of stop, recognize when we are doing so, stop that, take the things that make us great, like you mentioned, Emily, and then maybe highlighting certain things that we could optimize so that we're not necessarily culturally adapting, but culturally hybridizing. And so I think this is a great then segue to the next question, which I'm going to ask you, Emily, which is within this community, either with people inside or outside of the API community, what advice would you give them to help them achieve, whether it's leadership positions, because we know that only 6% of the US CEOs are actually of API descent, or to create a more inclusive working environment for the API community?
What a great question. It's, I might say two things, and I'm sure all the panelists have wonderful wisdom. I think there's two things. One, which is, it's actually important that we speak not only on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of others. And I think, without sort of going into too far into the research, right? But where does this affirmative action sort of notion of if I gain, you lose come from, right? Like, so in the last year, I did a bunch of research and we published a bunch of work on the Asian American recovery in light of COVID. And one of this notion around, it was on a bunch of media interviews, and there was this constant question of, well, who's doing all this shoving on Asians? Like, what is happening? And there's this notion of stoking this narrative of where are these acts of aggression coming from? And the reality is those that are hurt others. And so I think there's this real opportunity for us to think about, and look, affirmative action had this wonderful arc and intention. And so I think we should all assume positive intention, but that's where this pie of, there's a giant pie, and if one percentage goes up, this other percentage must therefore come down, was created. And there was this scarce pool of resources, and we're all clamoring for it. And so I think that if we kind of recognize the beauty of the tool, but not use it as a metric for us to think about our own pie allocation, then it allows us to speak on behalf of the broader minority diaspora, if you will. And then I think the second thing is kind of bringing it down to the micro, which is like, what can I do? What can I do as a manager or even as an individual contributor? And for me, I loved what you all said earlier around speaking, using your voice. And I love this notion, Lisa, I think we've all been there, the 23 or 24-year-old who sees something we know is wrong, but not feeling like we are in a position to say it. I gave this tip on one of my, because I started doing it, which is I started titling all my emails that when I saw something wrong, I know it may not have been your intention, ... And then I just write whatever the hell I write in the body of the email, because it assumes positive intention, but it does call out when you see certain things happening. And I think because for example, I think when we talk about the model minority that you were talking about, we actually fail to recognize that Asian Americans, for example, in New York City, are on average represent the largest population living under the poverty line. And that's the other side of that model minority that we actually never really shine a light on. And so I think we have to educate ourselves. We actually have to educate ourselves because we are that top of the 1% or 2%. And so how do we actually represent for the rest of the model minority who aren't actually modeling? And I think that's really, something that I would ask all of us that are on this call to kind of recognize.
If I can build on what you're saying, Emily, because I think, it's when we think about how, people who are, of AAPI folks who want to focus on how they build a career, there is still a lack of available mentors. We've made a lot of progress. Like I think this panel here is evidence that we are making progress. But the reality is, if we all waited for the mentors to show up, we still are going to be waiting a while. So, strong recommendation. Look at your network on LinkedIn. Look at the people who are making waves. Reach out. You would be surprised how many people are actually interested in helping and mentoring because they actually believe that this is essential, right, to our, to our growth, as a society on the whole, not just Asians, but our growth on the whole. And I think the other piece of advice that I have is once you make it to the place where you can actually be a mentor, drive impact, never forget that leadership occurs on three fronts. It happens from the front when you are helping to drive decisions, right? And drive direction. It happens from the back when you're allowing your team to kind of take the driver's seat and truly, move things forward, and you're there as the supporting arm for when they, for when they need you for coverage. But let's not forget leading from the side, as mentors, providing guidance, in the trenches with people as they're trying to make their way. So knowing to pull up, as you make your way to the top, I think is super important, for all of our growth.
I think there's also something to be said about the resources, just to kind of build off of something that both Emily and Lisa said. I think that as a community, we can do better about asking the questions. What's holding you back? Are you not aware of how to grow and develop in that conversation? Do you not feel comfortable? Do you feel like there's something that you need that you're not getting? So I think part of that growth and part of the curiosity is to try to get down to the root of it, to understand why do we not have more Asian women stepping up? Why do we not, or maybe they have and they haven't been given that opportunity. So trying to understand it as a whole, so then we can really build together to say, as women that are in leadership positions, this is what we can provide to these younger Asian women coming up. So that way they can be proactive, understand some of the resources and how to navigate. Because I think some of that is really the scary part about navigating. You don't feel comfortable, you don't know what your abilities are, and having that confidence and that support system to be able to have a voice and to speak for yourself.
And what advice would you give someone maybe of not that particular community? Because I know we hinted at this a little bit, and I love what you said, Emily, where hurt begets hurt. And I think there's an opportunity not only to be sort of cultivate allies, but also be allies for other communities as well. And so for our allies on the call, what advice would you give them as someone who is keen to support the community, or what actions do you think they'd be able to take?
I mean, I think participating in panels like this are a good first step, right? A lot of it is education, right? It's understanding the work environment that your colleagues are working in and coming to panels like this where they may speak more personally to their experiences. You won't necessarily get that in your Zoom call when you've got 45 minutes to get to the topic and you got to finish and get out. And so I think, those conversations, certainly obviously the more you get to know people on a deeper level beyond just the superficial is a big thing. I think there was a question in the chats about sort of, how do you raise your children in today's environment? And I'll admit, I have a 3-year-old daughter, she's mixed, and, you kind of look at this country and you're just kind of especially over the last couple of, of months, and sort of, I don't really recognize it much anymore. Maybe so much that, because I think people are less afraid to hate in public. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, in the sense that you can call them out and you can see those things more visibly. And yet at the same time, it's sort of shocking that that still exists around, right? But I think the one thing you cannot do is you cannot cow to it. And I think the one thing I probably would say has served well, particularly over the last couple of decades, is, is to be unafraid to sort of stand and speak your truth. Because really, that's how else are you going to operate in a way that's meaningful to you? And, the people who are uncomfortable with it either are willing to be educated and willing to get to know parts of you beyond just the superficial. Or, it may be that the company you're working at is not the right place. And I think what really sort of gives me hope, particularly for younger generations coming up, is a clear lack of tolerance for working environments in companies that don't sort of adhere to those sort of universal truths about humanity and doing good, et cetera, that kind of thing. And that, even during COVID and the anti-Asian violence rates increasing, the number of companies stepping up to host panels, to speak about the experience, to understand what that experience was like, I think, certainly is a lot more than it would have been even 10 years ago. And so I think just continuously pushing to make sure that you are not silenced, that you do educate your kids on what it is that makes them super unique. And thank God in this day and age, we have resources for that, books and shows, and, you can't be what you don't see, right? And so that's a huge key.
I maybe pulling on Cindy, what you just said, to your question, Josephine, about what advice, I have two things, which is one, share your nervousness. I think Samuel B., I loved how you started, which was like, I'm really nervous. My husband says that to me all the time. He's like, I feel really clumsy about this. I don't know how to talk about this. And to be honest, I feel the same way when I, embark in other territories. I think it's okay to be a little bit vulnerable and say that. I think the second is to ask questions, because Cindy, I totally agree with you that we all have to speak our truth. But I think that there's an ask of Asians and there's an ask of the others, which is the others to ask questions and for us to be open-minded and empathetic in our answer. I'll give you an example. During COVID, we bought a house in upstate New York, and the plumber showed up, no joke, with a Confederate flag in the back of his car. And, and fact, he, I don't know, has a Confederate flag 2 hours outside of New York City, coupled with like many, many, many Trump stickers. And, and at the core, he's a really nice human being. And he asked me all these questions about what it means for me as a first generation, if I like to eat pig's feet, how could I eat chicken feet? I mean, all of the questions that I thought it was so endearing that he asked. And I think, and we had a really lively debate about Trump. And I think if I did not, I hope if he didn't feel okay and safe to ask me those questions, that conversation would have never happened. And I just invite us to all maybe indulge a bit in that discomfort, because if we each, speak unequivocally our truth, it may not invite the line of questioning and that uncomfortable conversation that I think will actually bring us together. I don't know if that resonates with the rest of the group.
I love it. I think that's such a great call out. I think that in order for us to grow and develop and understand one another, you have to get uncomfortable to get comfortable. You have to ask questions, because you can't just assume something about someone's culture or their beliefs or who they are, whether you are a man, a woman, what culture you're from. In order for us to continue to really grow together, we have to understand one another and the why. Like, why do you do that, or why do you not do that, or is that appropriate to ask you what religion do Asians celebrate, because it seems like there's multiple. And so I love the ask the questions, be comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations, but also be respectful and be sensitive when asking those questions, and don't just assume what the answer is going to be. And if you ask the question, you have to be prepared for the answer. You may or may not like it. But again, you have to be open to having the conversation and making sure that we continue to take that information, which is powerful information, and be able to change that narrative and change the way that you look or you behave towards that moving forward.
That's so powerful, Heidi, because I often, as an ally, I also often feel uncomfortable asking questions too, because am I going to sound stupid? Am I going to sound educated? I don't want to offend anyone. But I think what I've also found is like being afraid of coming off the wrong way actually probably doesn't do you more good than actually asking the question and kind of educating yourself. And if there's people on the call that also resonate with that, I always start with the line of, I don't mean to like offend you in any way. I'm just trying to learn. Context is king. I think more often than not, people will be willing to say, absolutely, I'm happy to answer all the questions you have, with the caveat, of course, Heidi, if you ask the question, you should be prepared for the answer with no conceived.
But to that point, just like one quick kind of turn, right? Because I think to the point of courageous conversations, right? I'm going to move this like, for those of you that work in marketing, one of the things that I used to encounter at the agency is, hey, we've got this brilliant idea. It's Lunar New Year. We're going to go put a red label on this, and then we're going to put the pack in there, and this is going to be our Lunar New Year promotion. This is, and they're like, isn't it brilliant? And I'm like, okay, one, I know I'm not the authority on Lunar New Year. And by the way, there's also, it's Lunar New Year, not Chinese New Year, because there are a lot of people who are not Chinese who celebrate the Lunar New Year. So one. So if they've thought of Lunar New Year, like that's a point. But I think, two, the courageous conversation that needs to be had after that is, okay, why are we doing this? Are we doing this because we believe putting red on the product is going to inspire more purchases? Or are we actually doing this because we're committed to celebrating the spirit of the holiday with the people that celebrate?
Mm-hmm.
We need to have more of those conversations, because one thing that does irk the crap out of me is all of the crazy Lunar New Year promotions, or, we're doing our own version of, Singles Day, the Double 11, with no kind of thought around, the purpose, like, why are we doing this? So I think that's kind of the courageous conversations that we need to have with our allies, because honestly, it's better for our business if we can actually come to a strategic solution for the creative, for the product, et cetera. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I just wanted to point that out.
No, absolutely. I think being an organization at Pernod, and I'm sure at Southern too, Heidi, like we think about how we want to be able to resonate with the consumers as much as possible. That in and of itself is marketing. And I think so being able to really, at least from a community perspective, be able to have that standout voice to say, something might not 100% be right, but also be able to, have the conversation of here's the possibilities how you would go about maybe moving forward with a multicultural strategy. And it's certainly something that's not a one-off conversation, but a multiple and a multifaceted conversation. I know that we are ending close to the end of the panel as well. There is, since we do have a couple of minutes left, I do want to be able to ask a question that did pop up from our group out here. Firstly, I just wanted to thank everyone for your vulnerability, for your willingness to be able to have these pretty hard to have conversations. And for those listening, your willingness to listen with an open mind and kind of hearing and hopefully taking some actions to be able to impact your community and impact yourself as well. So we do have one question from the group chat, which is, how do you practice self-care to avoid burnout, either personally or professionally?
I mean, I don't.
I love to travel.
Maybe another answer.
I mean,
I love to travel.
That's right, Heidi, you're a big traveler.
Yeah, I think it's so important to just take that time, travel, take some downtime, immerse yourself in different cultures, see the world, have that experience, so that way you can continue to do better and be better, and to have that perspective. Like every time I travel, I learn something new and I come back home so grateful and just have so much gratitude to be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, travel for sure was a great way to sort of just expand outside of your existing boundaries, right? Just seeing different things is a big deal. And in COVID, I have a little who can't be vaccinated yet. So we still live our lives like an unvaccinated family. And it's very restricting and very boring. And, but I think we do a program through our company now with a well-being coach, if you will. So I do those sessions just to have somebody else identify for me anyway. Like I think the coach, maybe in the first conversation, she was like, how connected do you feel to yourself? And I remember thinking usually pretty, but like pretty connected. And then in the 2 years that COVID has happened, I don't feel connected at all. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I'm just trying to survive the day. But eventually we settle into a new normal, and now it's like I'm slowly getting back to it. But I will admit, like it's terribly hard. We've had some extenuating circumstances, but it is incredibly hard, I think, in today's environment to figure out exactly how to take time for yourself in a way that's meaningful, not just, oh, I'm just going to check this box and go get X done, or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
Right, absolutely.
I have just maybe 2 suggestions, and I think different things work for different people. I think on the micro scale, I generally try to take an inventory every day of what gave me energy and what took energy away. And I try to think about it in terms of the things that I was doing, the activities I was doing, as well as the people that I was around. And I just try to replicate that as much as possible. And then on the macro scale, I think, it's really trying to make sure that I know what are my sources of meaning. And there are actually great books out there that talk about sources of meaning, because I think whenever I feel the least energized or the most close to burnout, there's something that's out of alignment in what is fulfilling me. And so I'll leave you, those are 2 things that I typically do.
Thank you, Emily. We are up at time, and I just wanted to thank you all panelists, Cindy, Emily, Lisa, Heidi, for joining our conversation today. We've certainly hit on a lot of different topics, from model minority myths to microaggressions to code switching. I really appreciate the candid conversations that you've brought today. I think we've learned a lot about the community and about ourselves as well. If the people on the call, if you have any additional questions, feel free to ping them on the chat. We'll try to do our best to get these to the panelists as soon as possible. And with that, we conclude the call. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a very happy API Heritage Month.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, everyone.